Hello everyone, welcome to another session by Jindal School of Journalism and Communication. I'm Ashish, Director of Admissions here. And today with me is Professor Kajori Sen. Professor Kajori has worked for long years in media before joining the academia, and she has the experience and exposure of both the worlds. And today's session is a very excited session, the real and the real. So we are going to understand how the news media work as well as the cinema works and what's the connection between them. One more very important thing about this is, and why I'm so excited about this session is because in last 1 year we have seen both the industries rising so far and very fast. So it is very important for you to understand these kind of mediums, understand their connections, how it works, and how you can make a great career in them. So welcome, Professor, and I'm sure this session is going to be very exciting and informative for our viewers.
Thank you so much, Ashish. And of course, thank you for everyone who is attending this. This is actually a bit of a passion project for me. I was a news journalist for broadcast news for many, many years. I'm also a huge film nerd. One of the things I realized when I started working as a broadcast journalist was how many narrative cues we were picking up from cinema. All of us who'd watched certain movies growing up were like, oh, we would like this shot to look like that. We want this story to give this kind of vibe. And then you start asking the question, what is the real difference between the two? Where does the difference come from? And does that actually mean anything? And if it does, how far? That's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm just going to share my screen so that I can give you a little bit of historical perspective, which I think is hugely important to understanding why we do this and where the real sort of focus on this entire matter comes from, where the relationships between cultural aspects as well as aspects of other kinds of narrative come from. All of these are significant when we look at the world that we are currently occupying and inhabiting, particularly when we are in the world of fake news and we're trying to differentiate between the real and the unreal on an everyday basis. So, without further ado, let me quickly share my screen and we are going to get started. And looking at the history of journalism, the history of storytelling, the history of cinema, the history of fiction, all of that over the next hour or so. Let's see, here we go. Well, there we are. So as you know, this session is called The Real and the Real, when news and cinema meet. But actually, if we look at it slightly more broadly, what this session should have been called is The Real and the Fictional, where news and fiction meet. Because at the end of the day, that's the real difference between what is seen as true and what is seen as fictionalized or narrativized or fantasized. So let's go back to prehistory for a while, shall we? Because news as we know it today is actually quite a recent and quite a modern phenomenon. News, if we historicize it, really begins in the 17th to 18th century in England. By the time it comes to India, we are hitting well into the mid 18th century. And so it's only really 300 years old, which in the larger aspect of human history is absolutely nothing. So where did we get information before that? Well, the history of information is the history of storytelling. It always has been. That's how we have, as people, exchanged information pretty much since the beginning of time. And it doesn't matter what kind of information it was. You could have somebody sitting around a fire and telling you the legends of the place around you, about things that walk in the dark, about places you should avoid, about horrors that lurk, about kindness and generosity, fairy tales which may border surprisingly close to the real. Of course, there was also gossip, because gossip is as old as mankind. And what is news if not verified gossip, really? And where would you get your gossip? You would get it while standing around the well trying to take out some water, while working in the fields. Somebody would be whispering to somebody else, did you hear what so-and-so was doing? And that word would spread like wildfire. And that word was also information. It was also communication. It was also a way of understanding how the rest of humankind worked. Now, of course, you had more official ways of certain kinds of information being disseminated. There have been court declarations, which, if you were Roman, were engraved in stone. There was graffiti, which people painted on walls. You had town callers who were given a certain piece of information from the king or from the nobility, who would go and stand in the middle of the town, ring their bell, and shout at the top of their voices whatever it was that people needed to know. A storm was coming. There was a fire which had caught somewhere. Taxes had been raised. Whatever it is that needed to be known, this was the way that that information was told. And very often it was a case of essentially whispers in the corridors, which is how all of this information carried. So there you were in the middle of a town where a town callers came and said that the country was going to war. And then you would tell someone else, who would tell someone else, who would tell someone else. And sometimes the information would remain the same. And sometimes, for any of you who've played this as a game as a child, you know that even when you're telling it from like 5 people or 6 people, information changes. And sometimes it changes radically. And in this case, it was thousands and thousands of people where these whispers were going through. But why did we have these processes of communication? Well, for a very simple reason. We are human, and we like to communicate. That really is all there is to it. We like to tell each other stories. We like to hear stories. We want to know things about other people. So communication has 2 purposes for human function. One is that it informs you about what is happening in the world around you. The other is that it interests you. It gives you a sense of mystery. It gives you a sense of fantasy. It gives you a sense of intrigue. It gives you a sense of sensationalism. And those are the 2 spaces that we're going to continue to investigate as we progress through the eras of the solidifying of the news media. Because, as I said, for most of human history, these aspects have gone hand in hand. If you look at storytelling as it existed in medieval England, for example, where bards would accompany heroes and knights and would write songs about their accomplishments, which would then be sung in inns and in courts. If you've watched Witcher, you know that's what Jaskier was doing for the Witcher. That was an actual employable job that you could do. If you've played D&D, you know that you can still play a bard. You can see it in our own mythology. If you've read or watched any version or adaptation of Mahabharata, the character of Sanjay is, if you will, an early chronicler, going to and fro from the battlefield to the blind King Dhritarashtra, painting quite literally through words a version of the picture of the battlefield itself for his king. The art of the chronicle and the art of the story are inextricable. They were inextricable 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, and they are equally inextricable today. It's just the way that we frame our own thoughts around them have started to change. So today, when we talk about journalism, we talk about neutral, we talk about objective, we talk about factual, all of which is great, but is all of it true? Let's find out. So where does journalism come from? Well, journalism, again, as we know it today, emerges from the development of the printing press in Europe, which happens around the 1400s in Germany. By the time it becomes more or less public or popularized, you've really hit the early part of the 1500s. And when the printing press has become sufficiently popularized, you simultaneously see a huge increase in education. Why? Because now people can print books to educate people other than writing it out by hand, which obviously took a lot of time, took a lot of effort, cost a lot of money, wasn't worth it. Now you had ways to do this for cheap. You had ways to get all of this out there very quickly, very efficiently. And so you suddenly had a lot of schools set up where you could teach people through the printed word, through printed material. And because of this democratization of education, you also had a democratization of information. Because if you taught me to read, now I want to read things. Obviously, what else am I doing with the skill set, right? And as that need arose, there was a huge rise in the demand for printed material that could be cheaply and effectively delivered to anyone who wanted to read them. Now, if you learned to read, what is it that you want to know? Well, there are 2 things that, again, to go back to what it is that information is supposed to do. You want information, and you want entertainment. And that is what all early printed material was giving you. It was either giving you sort of sensational fun things to read, or it was telling you, this is a good time for crops to be taken to the market. This is when the ships are going to be coming in. This is when the court is going to meet to take a decision on a certain critical thing. This is what the king has now decided. This is what the nobility has now decided. So you've got all of that information, and you've got stories about things people want to read about, which amazingly hasn't changed that much. People in the 1600s wanted to read about romance. They wanted to read about murder. They wanted to read about, all of the fun things that we want to read and see today. It was just in slightly different forms because those were the storytelling techniques that you had then. So you had all of this material which was being circulated. You also obviously had a huge amount of religious material which was being circulated. This is when the democratization, if you will, of the Bible takes place in pretty much all of Europe. And while all of this is going on, you have the rise of what is known as scientific thought or scientific principle, which is that there are certain things which are divorced from religion. Here's the thing: when everyone can access religion, as opposed to it being handed out in bits and parcels to the populace by somebody who is seen as a higher entity, like a cardinal or a pope, people are like, maybe that doesn't happen because of why the religious book is saying so. And then somebody starts investigating into scientific elements of it and says something earth-shatteringly controversial, like maybe the earth is not the center of the universe. Shock, horror, must get rid of Galileo immediately. But as those conversations increased, and as the age of enlightenment right through the 1700s really came into being, what you had was an increasing separation between those spaces which were seen as quote unquote factual and scientific, and those which were seen as quote unquote, again, religious and imagined. And there was a fairly clear line and a distinction which was being drawn between these two spaces. It is from this age of enlightenment that the idea of the modern day newspaper emerges. The modern day newspaper emerges as a space which was supposed to respect the rational. It was supposed to respect the objective. It was supposed to be a space which existed purely to inform in the most neutral way possible. And that was the ideal behind the newspaper. You had other kinds of documents. You had pamphlets, you had broadsheets, you had sort of little booklets, all of which were printed for fiction. But the newspaper was meant to be above those. Was this true? No, it wasn't. That's the short answer. While newspapers were meant to be these sort of sober, factual pieces of reportage that brought ethical reports to their audience, newspaper owners also needed to make some money. And to make money, they needed to sell. And how was a newspaper owner going to sell? Well, they were going to sell by writing things or telling stories which were of interest to the audience. Now, it wasn't necessary that your story, no matter how worthy, factual, and ethical it was going to be able to sell. So newspaper owners started thinking of ways and techniques to draw audiences in. Now, one of the ways that they did it was you had a place for opinions, for fiction, for ideas which were beyond that, for discussions, and use that as a way to reel in the audience. These were very clearly marked. These were very clearly sort of signposted. And so you came, you read so you say bought a copy in the 1800s of the very famous English magazine called The Strand, and you bought it to read the latest Sherlock Holmes short story. You weren't buying it to read the news, but The Strand hoped that while you were reading Sherlock Holmes, you would flip through the rest of the magazine and read the serious news stories that they had there. So that was the more ethical way of dealing with the problem of sales. The less ethical way was sensationalizing news to the point where it was almost unrecognizable from fiction. This, for example, is a piece of art from from what is a fairly famous broadsheet in England in the late 1800s. And as you can see, it's obviously a cartoon, but the cartoon is there for a form of political commentary about a certain kind of elections. And it is playing into, as you can see, it says third term twaddle. So it's being funny, it's being sort of sensationalist, it's playing into local legend, it's picking up on all of these very localized customs while also making a form of political commentary, and therefore blurring the lines, if you will, between the sobriety of news and the fun fantasy of the fictional world. Sometimes you had scenarios where fiction writers quite deliberately used the sobriety of newspapers to try and get a few extra eyeballs for themselves. These are a couple of cases there where the lines blurred to the point where it was almost, and in some cases most definitely, unrecognizable. The first case happened in 1809. A famous author, famous then, he was just an upcoming author, called Washington Irving. He was best known later on for his stories Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In 1809, Washington Irving was like 21, 22 years old, and he had just written his first book. And nobody wanted to buy his book because nobody had heard of Washington Irving or what he did. So Washington Irving decided to play what was a fairly smart PR move. Washington Irving wrote to a series of New York newspapers, and he said that a famous Dutch historian had come to visit New York and he had disappeared, leaving his manuscript behind. And everybody was like, what? And he was like, yeah, I mean, maybe his manuscript is a way that we can figure out what happened to him. And it's so important that we find him. So a police complaint was lodged. A full-blown police manhunt was taking place for where this gentleman called Diedrich Knickerbocker had disappeared to. And as all of that was happening, bits and pieces of this manuscript, which was going to be a way of figuring out what happened to him, was simultaneously being released. So you had a serious business newspaper, which did serious business work, suddenly talking about this fictional manuscript and this fictional person who had disappeared because of the way that it had been framed for them. Finally, Washington Irving came out with the truth. He said this had all been a little sort of prank project, and his book was a bestseller because everybody wanted to know what the rest of Diedrich Knickerbocker's manuscript said. But the fact that he used the idea of trust, of faith, of reality in a way to market his own fiction meant that there was already a clear consciousness of how these spaces blurred. The second one was actually done by one of the newspapers themselves. It's a newspaper that actually was very popular in New York in the mid-1800s, called The Sun. In 1835, The Sun published a series of 6 articles. These articles, one after the other, were attributed to a super popular English astronomer. And remember, this is 1835. You weren't exactly going to take a boat over to England to verify this information independently, right? Called Sir John Herschel. And he was a real person. People knew about him. And it said that Sir John Herschel had invented a super telescope. And this super telescope had proven beyond doubt that there was not just life, but civilization on the moon. And he was going to tell us everything that he had seen there. And they said this had originally been printed by the Edinburgh Reporter, and now they had gotten the exclusive rights to publish this in The Sun. And people just lapped that stuff up. They thought it was the most interesting thing they had ever read. The readership of The Sun went up ridiculously high. Like, it had been a relatively popular newspaper then, but suddenly it went from being pretty popular to crazy popular. And Sir John Herschel, who obviously had no clue about any of this, neither did the Edinburgh Reporter, obviously couldn't say no, that he had done no such thing. Finally, The Sun did, say, well, that was just a little joke we were playing on you. We still don't know who wrote those original 6 articles, but The Sun had gotten what it needed. It had gotten subscriptions, it had gotten advertisements, it had gotten money. And how had he gotten it? By essentially telling a good old-fashioned lie. And as you can see that article there from one of The Sun's rivals being like the famous moon hoax that fooled the whole world, it did. It worked. And this wasn't just limited to newspapers. When we saw the move happening in the late 1800s and the early 1900s from the printed form to the audio form, when radios started being placed in every home, we saw probably the most famous quote unquote hoax that ever took place. The interesting part of this one was it wasn't meant to be a hoax. It just turned out that way. On the 30th of October, 1938, Orson Welles, he was 23 years old. He was going to eventually become one of the biggest actors, directors in the world. At this point, he was doing radio broadcasts. And he was doing a radio broadcast, in this case, of a dramatized, Americanized adaptation of the famous H.G. Wells novel from 1898, War of the World, which was a novel about Martians invading Earth. Now, here's where things went a little wrong. The broadcast was supposed to begin at a certain time. The broadcast actually began a few moments early. So by the time people tuned in, they hadn't heard the bit where it said this was fictional. So they assumed, like they did for so much on the radio, that this was actual real information. And what was the real information? The real information, as Orson Welles sort of boomed in his like really deep, resonant, serious voice, as he had adapted it in the form of a news broadcast, Martians had invaded New Jersey. And there was absolute panic. Like all of the New Jersey, New York area went absolutely crazy. Millions of radio listeners were genuinely convinced that a real Martian invasion had taken place. People were trying to flee. If you've ever watched Independence Day, when the real aliens attack, it looked a little bit like that. There were people in their cars trying to get out of New Jersey before the Martians came for them. People were begging the police to come and protect them. They were asking for gas masks. One of the parts was about how the Martian ships were releasing toxic gas, begging for gas masks to protect them, asking for electric companies to turn off the power. In some cases, the electric companies actually just freaked out themselves and turned off the power so that the Martians wouldn't see the light and would leave them alone. Wells finishes this broadcast, he comes out, and there are millions of calls coming into the radio station with people going absolutely wild, trying to get more details about what is happening and where the Martians were. So Wells goes back in, and Wells is like, look, guys, that was all fiction. But here's the thing about saying something later. By that point, a significant amount of damage had already been done. Your roads were already clogged. People had already locked up their houses. Panic had already struck. It takes a second for panic to strike. It takes significantly longer for panic to die down. And when you see these spaces again intersect in a way that they so often do, deliberately or not, these are the consequences that can take place. Now, when we're talking about video obviously is a very much a 20th century phenomenon, and video begins with the invention of what is called the newsreel. So TV as a phenomenon obviously comes to the world quite a bit later. It comes to the world in the 1950s, and really you'll start seeing it in American homes by the time you hit the early 1960s. If you're looking at India, we're talking about the late 1970s, 1980s. But the newsreel goes back significantly further. The newsreel came into being in the early half of the 20th century and became very quickly a popular way of presenting news and current affairs through video techniques. So you know how the old saying goes that a picture is worth 1,000 words? Well, people were like, video is worth 5,000. It's pictures, but better and with sound. So with the lack of home video access, where were people going to watch stuff? They were going to watch stuff on TV. So they were going to watch stuff in the theater. Now, what you had was the emergence, or in the early days of cinema, of what was known as the nickel Odeon. Odeon means theater. Nickel was what you paid to get into it. So if you ever see the kids' TV channel Nickelodeon, that's where the phrase comes from. So you would go to the theater, you would buy your ticket, you would go, you would sit down. the first 10 minutes would be a newsreel. And the newsreel could be of any major event that the producers of the newsreel thought was important enough for everybody to know and get a visual sense of. It could be big sports stories, it could be a big crime stories, it could be big political stories, it could be any of those things. So it could be elections, it could be the Super Bowl, it could be all of the World Cup, it could be any of that. Whatever people thought was worthy of being the big headlining story of that week was what was going to be played out for the first 10 minutes. This could be 1, 2, sometimes up to 3 stories. After those 10 minutes, you would go into what was known as your main feature, which was the piece of fiction that you had come to watch in the theater in the first place. So producers, seeing this sort of new and incredible way of delivering information, and by the time you hit the 1930s, you had newsreels playing in almost every theater in America. The era of the Hollywood studios was the 1920s, which is when they really start rising. By the 1930s, the big Hollywood studios, the Big Five, as they were known, had already established themselves. And every single Hollywood studio owned, at this point, approximately 900 to 1,000 theaters. So you had thousands of theaters across America. Each theater would be playing a movie and would be playing a newsreel. The movie would usually be on a week-to-week basis. The newsreel would often change on a bi-weekly basis by the time you hit the mid-1930s. Now, you could, and you wouldn't be wrong in saying, well, that seems fair enough. You watch your news, you watch your film. There is no real similarity between the two. You go home. Except that's not how visual cultures work. If you've ever been to a movie today, you know that they show trailers before a film. There are certain kinds of trailers which are chosen before different kinds of film. If I am going to watch the new Marvel movie, then the kind of trailers they will show me will be different from somebody who is going to watch the new Salman Khan movie. There is an idea of continuity that comes into play when two visual texts are put together. And this was something that obviously people were well aware of. So while there was no actual visible connection between the newsreel and the film that followed, the two were used quite often, actually, to build a narrative in a collaborative way. So this was especially true in the late 1930s and the 1940s. Why? Because this is when your full propaganda artillery of the British government, of the American government, and it wasn't just happening in white countries, of the Japanese government, everybody was doing it. The Germans were experts at it. Nazi propaganda had been shown in movie theaters for years and years and years. Videos of war efforts on the newsreel were simultaneously shown with fictionalized stories of heroism and nationalism. What happens when you show these things next to each other? You are looking at the kind of degradation and deprivation and violence that war is causing, but you're simultaneously looking at the stories which are being told about your nation, about what it is that you're protecting, about the people who matter, about the way of life that you want to protect. Bring the two together, and what you have there is good old school propaganda. So by the time you hit the 1950s and 60s, once you see really detailed conversation actually taking place pretty much across the world in the wake of both the Second World War and the rise of the Cold War about what information should be shown, what information should be shown in which spaces, how those informations should be contextualized. You remember, we are very scared of the fascists, and we're very scared of the communists. And sometimes we're not sure which one is which in the 1950s and the 1960s. So these distinctions then become very important. So news goes back to that sort of 1800s idea of being a place of calm, rational reportage. Fiction goes back to being spaces where certain kinds of storylines and narratives are explored. Again, these are lines which are being drawn in a way of telling the viewer that these lines are independent. but these two products coexist very often in the same space, much as they did with the newspaper, much as they did on the big screen, and much as they continue to do on the small screen in the 50s and 60s, and on the internet in the 2010s and 2020s. These distinctions are there to give ideas of certain kinds of objectivities, which may or may not be true. And even if they are, they play into fictional identities in a way that is constantly reinforcing each other. The news cycle becomes a huge influence on filmmakers, and filmmakers simultaneously become a huge influence on news creators. And the way that that feedback loop continues to work, both in print as well as in on screen, is a reality that today, when we look at 2021, has created the specific environment of fear of what is real and what is not that we're dealing with in the era of the internet and multiple news sources, multiple sources of information that is constantly bombarding us with various versions of the truth. I want to look at a couple of images before I open this conversation up for questions. The first are these two images in front of you. The one that you see on one side is a real news image. The one that you see on the other is from a film. The first one is a photograph that was taken after the bombing that took place in Japan, the nuclear bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki. But it's not just that one image. Japan had suffered consistent aggressive bombing by American forces pretty much right through the Second World War. Pretty much every city in Japan was left in rubble. It was destroyed to the ground. It was the similarity between the photographs and the newsreels that exist from that time are exactly what is being reflected in the other photograph that you see on your screen, which is a screenshot from 1954's Godzilla. For anyone who knows about Godzilla, as you should, a new Godzilla film just came out. It's called Godzilla versus King Kong, and it has nothing to do with the 1950s Tokyo. But the original Godzilla was a monster which had quite literally risen from the rubble of war and had brought further destruction in its wake. For a country in whose imagination, the image of destroyed cities was unalienably seared, like you would never forget what this looked like. When somebody was showing you that and showing a fictional sort of not CGI, because this is a stop motion lizard monster dinosaur beast stampeding his way, suddenly it wasn't the stampeding monster that you were thinking of. It was again the destruction that was left. They were trying in their storytelling capacity to evoke the memories of the past that had been. It was a shortcut to create a sense of anger, to create a sense of anxiety, to bring a tear to somebody's eye. One of these men is an actual real-life serial killer. The other one is the fictional version of said real-life serial killer. Ed Gein was a murderer in Wisconsin in the late 1950s. In 1958, Ed Gein was captured. He had murdered 4 women. He had skinned their bodies. He had used their skin to decorate his house. It was entirely possible that he had cannibalized their bodies. He lived in a ramshackle little house in the middle of nowhere. These women had stopped at his house in their cars so that they could have a place to sleep, because he was also offering a cheap motel service. His mother had died a few years ago, and it was said that ever since his mother's death, he had become stranger and stranger. He had been very close to his mother and had what was seen as a very peculiar relationship with her. Most people will never have heard of Ed Gein. However, a lot of people will have heard the man that was narrativized through Ed Gein. When the Ed Gein murders took place, a man called Robert Bloch was living in Wisconsin, and he followed the newspaper coverage and the television coverage of this very, very closely. He wrote a book which was picked up by an American director and made into probably one of the most popular psychothriller, probably the father, if you will, of psychothriller movies, Alfred Hitchcock. The film was called Psycho. That is Norman Bates. Bates Motel is still a TV show that is super popular, plays into the same murder anxieties, plays into the same idea of spaces which are occupied by men who will prey on young, vulnerable women in these places, obsessed with their parents, obsessed with their mothers in ways that are dangerous and predatory. And the similarities, if you look at the newsreel coverage of Ed Gein and the way Alfred Hitchcock used those images in the film, which came out only 3 years after Ed Gein's murders had been committed. It was, again, a quick visual shortcut that Hitchcock could use. Whether you've heard of Ed Gein today or not isn't really relevant. Everyone in America at that point would have heard of Ed Gein, very much like everyone in Japan at that point would have remembered the bombings of the Second World War. You were playing into a cultural imagination that already existed because the news set it up and then the filmmaker knocked it down. But what remains in the imagination that continues? People may forget Ed Gein, people may forget the photographs of Tokyo, but people will not forget Godzilla stomping through it. People will not forget Norman Bates saying a man's best friend is his mother, or stabbing somebody from behind a curtain. So if news feeds into film, film feeds into imagination, imagination feeds into how future news products frame things. For a more contemporary example, let's come into at least the 21st century, if not the immediate 2020s. On one side is the picture of the Taliban. On the other side is Iron Man being kidnapped by a mysterious Afghani terror group that wants his military material. This is a movie made in 2008. In 2001, 9/11 takes place. In 2002, America goes to war against Afghanistan. In 2004, America goes to war against Iraq. The Middle East is already a place where certain stereotypes of terrorist activity, of bearded men carrying guns, committing certain forms of violence against white bodies, sort of white soldiers, white industrialists, white corporate entities, white men in general, is something that has been established through wall-to-wall newspaper and television coverage. Iron Man is well aware of this. Why choose to make it a story set here? Didn't have to. The original comics weren't set in Afghanistan, because again, it's a quick visual cue. You want bad guys, this gives you bad guys. You want someone to look at a screen and start talking about a hero fighting the forces of evil. The news reportage process has already done it for you. What Iron Man does is use that process to kick it once again into high gear. So that is the relationship that we see historically between these spaces. It is what has existed for centuries. It was what will continue to exist. And today, as I mentioned earlier, those lines are blurring in a way that those lines have never blurred before. What is real and what is not, what is fictional and what is not. We are playing into the same cultural stereotypes. We're playing into the same imagined spaces. And that is really what is leading to how we are creating our public and popular stories, both in the context of what is happening outside as well as in the context of what is happening within. What is fact? What is fiction? How closely are the two tied? That's always going to be something we're going to have to consider very seriously and take into absolute account when we look at any piece of work, fictional, or factual. Ashish,
Thank
do
you,
we have
Professor.
questions?
It was an amazing session and learning a lot about history as well and how it started. And this Mars story is amazing. I am sure a lot of people would not be aware about it that it has happened.
Yeah.
And I totally related with it with one more movie which came, which was about this piranha, and suddenly
Mm-hmm.
people stopped going to beaches in the US.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a very similar story.
After Jaws, lots of people stopped going to beaches as well. They were afraid
After
there would be
Jaws,
shark
yes.
attacks.
Even after Jaws as well,
Yeah.
yes, it's right. So,
Let's take questions. I see that we've got a
right.
few questions on the YouTube chat.
So we
So,
have few questions. We have Pawan who has asked that, ma'am, what is your view on neutral journalism? Does it even exist?
okay, so I think that's a very, very fair question, particularly today. I think that we should, no, I don't think neutral journalism exists. I think there is ethical journalism. I think there can be journalism which provides facts. I think there can be journalism which is verified. I think there is journalism which is, as far as possible, giving as much proven information as possible. Neutrality is next to impossible to achieve. All of us are human. Every journalist is human. They're all going to come in with their own inherent biases. Even if we try to keep them out of it, we have certain ways that we see the world. That's always going to play a slight role, no matter how hard you're trying. But as long as your information is accurate, as long as your information is verified, as long as you are honest, as long as you're trying at least to the best of your ability to give both sides of the story, it will be good journalism. Will it be neutral journalism? Not necessarily, but it will be good journalism.
Right. We have one more thing, which is Tanish. Tanish has asked that, what is your view on future of journalism?
I wish I could tell you. I think that we are now, and I would say this is true in the last 7 years, really, not particularly long, which is why none of us really have a clue how to deal with it. We're at a time when the world is changing in ways that nobody had really expected. We've moved from the era of a journalist delivering information to a much more interconnected ecosystem of information delivery. In a way, and it's a weird thing to say, but we are moving almost back to the people around the well that I started out with, sort of whispering gossip to each other. Some town caller person can go and stand in the middle of the town and declare something, but by the time it gets to the people around the well, that information could have and very often changed completely. And that's exactly what we see with the internet. We've gone back 3,000 years while going forward, many, many decades. Technology has allowed the grouping of people to exchange information in very intimate ways. And what the implications of that is that today we are constantly questioning what is being told to us by authority, but we're also constantly questioning what's being told to us by each other. And that's leading to an environment of general distrust. And what general distrust means is we don't know who to believe. When we don't know who to believe, we are automatically imposing our own biases upon any information that we are given, which is leading to the space of misinformation. I assume the future of journalism in the next decade is going to be refiguring who we can trust. I think today the job of journalists is to build up trust with the audience. And that is what they're going to have to focus on for the next decade. How they're going to do that in the era of social media is something we're still negotiating, but that's the most important thing for them to do.
Right. So in addition to that, she has also asked one more thing, which I also think very important is that what is your view on narrative building in the age of Twitter and YouTube, where everyone is practically a journalist or anyone can become a journalist?
Right. So I think that takes off really from what I was mentioning in my last answer. So let me go into a little more detail. Let's talk for a second about how social media works and how social media is operationalized. And when I'm saying this, I'm also talking about social media as multiple different spaces, not as a single unit. I think one of the problems that we've had as journalists trying to engage with social media is that we have been used to homogeneous mediums. We've been used to mediums being like, there is television. You can have multiple channels, but they're all television, right? You have newspapers. There can be multiple newspapers, but they're all newspapers. They're all essentially performing the same function. Social media is not a homogeneous entity. The way I perform narrative on Twitter is going to be different from how I perform narrative on Facebook. It's going to be different from how I perform narrative on Instagram. It's going to be different from how I perform narrative on TikTok. These are, or it's going to be different from how I perform narrative on WhatsApp. They are groups with different audiences, different narrative structures, different time frames, different kinds of usage, different algorithms of access. And for people to be able to use all of them, they have to be skilled not in one form of narrative building, but in multiple forms of narrative building. Because if you're trying to create the same narrative across different platforms, you're going to use different storytelling techniques for every single one of them. Some of them are more dependent on intimacies. WhatsApp is a family, friends, closed circle. Similarly, Facebook is a familial friend close circle. Twitter is seen as much more public. It's seen as much more political. I don't talk to a friend in the way that I talk to a person I'm meeting in a political or social gathering, a more formal acquaintance. My language changes, and therefore narrative changes. Similarly, if you're looking at the idea of video, what you would shoot for Insta, what you would shoot for TikTok would be different kinds of videos. And if you coalesced all of those processes into how they're now fitting into cinema, what you see is cinema is picking up those techniques in how they are writing their ideas of engagement as well.
Right.
Any more questions, Ashish?
So we have one more, which is from Achal, and she's saying that you stated that the distinction between fiction and news was intensified in the 1950s. But don't you believe that the news that is delivered today is all fiction and not even close to reality?
Achal, I don't want to be quite so pessimistic. Let me put it that way. I don't think all news is fiction. I think that what we have seen in the last 7 years is an effort for news to try and catch up with narrative styles that a lot of the practitioners of news have no familiarity with. And in that process, I think we have seen a process of sensationalism where those lines are blurring. But I also think there is incredible ethical journalism out there. I think there are people who are putting in the hard work. I think there are people who are going out into the field, who are getting the real reports. I think that, okay, in fact, it was an example I was going to put in, and then I was like, maybe we'll run out of time. We had enough examples there. One of the Indian examples, which I think is really interesting to me, is the example of Article 15, the film. Article 15, for those of you who've seen it, is about the rape and murder of two Dalit girls in UP, and this police officer who solves the crime. I don't know whether you know this, but that was based on an actual case. It was based on the Badaun rape and murder case, which took place in 2014. Now, in the Badaun rape and murder case, and in fact, there are very similar images. I reported on the Badaun murder case. I remember the footage that was shot. The footage that was shot with these two bodies hanging from this tree against the silhouette of the sky. If you watch the moment that the bodies are discovered in Article 15, the director has mimicked that exact shot, which was on the front page and on the top headline of every newspaper and every TV channel for those 2 weeks in 2014, when everybody was talking about the Badaun rape. What's the difference between Article 15 and the real case? The real case was never solved. Those girls were raped, they were killed, they were left in a field, and people refused to even acknowledge that it was murder. let alone find the people behind it. Article 15 gave you closure. Article 15 gave you an answer. The great thing about film is that it can do that for you in a way that real life can't. And narrativization lets that process take place. I think what has happened today is that news is trying to give you closure, which it's not news's place to do. That is fiction's place to do. News's place is to ask questions. It's not to give you answers. Fiction can give you answers. The real world doesn't work like that.
Right. So with that, we have come to the end of the session. Professor, any final message for our upcoming journalism students and those who are planning to come to JSJC?
Come learn storytelling. We've been doing it. The world's been telling stories for 1,000 years. JSJC is trying to teach you how to tell stories today. What those stories are going to be, that's up to you. Whether you want to tell those stories online, whether you want to tell them in a movie theater, whether you want to tell them on radio, do you want them to be fictional, you want them to be real, that's your call. But what we will do is tell you how to tell those stories.
Thank you so much for your time. I'm sure our students will be excited to meet you in person whenever the campus open and the new session starts.
And I look forward to meeting them.
Right. So thank you so much and enjoy your weekend. It was a great session.
Thank you, Ashish, and thank you for everyone who's tuned in.